Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, sills, desolators, peasants, vassals. I'm a useful idiot. Today I want to talk about public research for private gain, or basically how colleges have come to represent everything but education. Their last concern is for teaching and for students. And of course, these students leave college with massive amounts of debt and a very paltry education in a lot of cases. So what we see colleges being used for is to basically co-opt the scientific community to support state policies. And that includes things like fracking and climate change and everything else. And then we also have colleges being used as recruiting grounds for professional football teams. And that's why we have coaches and people who head sports departments for major colleges all over the country that make more than the people who actually run the states themselves, the governors, and huge amounts of money that go to these schools for those programs. And then what I'm going to talk about today, one of my pet peeves, is the whole idea that there's a whole bunch of public research that's funded by taxpayer money in the federal government that essentially ends up in private hands. And that's one of the major functions of colleges. I live out here in Washington, and I have 2 degrees from the University of Washington, and they're one of the worst offenders of this sort of policy. I think something like 200 some odd private companies have been created out of the research done at the University of Washington. And that's not really how it should work. And this also becomes relevant recently, and this is the tie-in that is going to make this relevant to people, is Janet Napolitano just left the Department of Homeland Security, and now she's going to go run research programs at the University of California, involved in nuclear weapons, for one thing. So she's going to be a prime example. Somebody going from the government back to the so-called private sector. And essentially, she's going to be helping run a research department where government money is used to finance projects that benefit private companies. So anyway, the focus of the story for me came from a new report that came out that said Regents recently approved a new corporate entity for the University of California. And in a unanimous vote last month, the Regents of the University of California created a corporate entity that will further codify and consolidate privatizing scientific research produced by taxpayer-funded university laboratories. This entity is called NUCO, at least for now. And there's a lot of colleges that have systems like this set up already, but this new story kind of illustrates exactly how this works, and that's why I will use it for an example. And what it does is, in the case of the University of California, they're going to apply this program to its UCLA medical centers, but will be using it as a template throughout the University of California system, which includes campuses all over the state, all over the country, for that matter. And the purpose of NUCO and this corporate entity is to completely revamp how scientific discoveries made in University of California laboratories, from new treatments for cancer to apps for smartphones, come to be used by the public. Now, traditionally, colleges have used their own technology offices to make these decisions. The fate of academic research will now be taken away from university employees and faculty and put in the hands of powerful board of business people, and they will be separate from the university. So we can already see what the pitfalls of this will be. It will block a substantial amount of research from the public, and it will reap huge benefits and access for corporations and investors, especially those with ties to the business people who will run this new entity. And we'll attach the article below, and when you look at the details, there's an incredible amount of nepotism and insider advantage. And this NUCO board will decide which University of California inventions to patent and how to structure licensing deals with private industry. It also have control over how to spend public funds on these activities. So once again, we have corporations invading public universities and basically deciding how this taxpayer money will be used to benefit them in the long run. And proponents say that this will bring much needed private sector experience, as they always do, to the task of commercializing university inventions. It will generate more patents and bigger revenues, which of course is music to the ears of these colleges. In fact, one regent at the University of California said when they just were talking about setting up an oversight committee for this new entity, NUCO, one regent said, quote, "It shouldn't be called the Regents Oversight Committee. It should be called the Regents Encouragement and Finding the Dough Committee," unquote. So they recognize it in a very crass way, exactly what this entity will do. And in fact, records show that wealthy investors and influential businessmen with close ties to UCLA and several regents specifically are financially invested in the companies that currently license university-owned patents under exclusive financial arrangements. And that's what this is all about. It's insider trading, it's insider investing, nepotism, favoritism, helping out your buddies and your cronies. Crony capitalism applied to our school system. So they will use university-licensed, university-owned patents under exclusive financial arrangements. And regents also invest in these businesses that profit for university research and are close friends and associates of the university-connected business people. So as I just pointed out, all the favoritism and nepotism and cronyism, all these people that are in charge of making the decisions are also heavily invested. So this reminds us of Congress and the intelligence industry and the security industry and the military-industrial complex and everything else. And as should be obvious, business people want several things. They want greater access to inventions with favorable terms, and like I say, that's when they get exclusive financial arrangements. They're interested in monopolies. And then they want the university to subsidize the early stage of research and development and business expenses. And then third, they want the U.S. to actually invest in these startups. So the outrage just piles on top of the outrage. Because first of all, they want quick and easy access to all the research, public research done at universities, whether it's medical research, weapons research, or anything else. And then they want exclusive, favorable terms. So they want something for nothing. And they also want the universities to subsidize these early stages of business expenses. So they also want, once these university-owned patents are set up under exclusive financial arrangements, they also want the universities to help subsidize these private startups and business expenses when these university-generated inventions are then factored into the private economy. And then they also want the universities to invest in the startups themselves, so not just the research and development, early stage of setting up the business, but also helping actually set up the businesses themselves. So once again, pretty outrageous. Private corporations go into our universities, they get sweetheart deals on inventions paid for with taxpayer money, and then everybody involved, from the scientists themselves to people in the school to lawyers to business people to investors, all get a piece of the pie. And some schools like Berkeley have different attitudes. They don't always get involved in that sort of mercenary attitudes towards this sort of work. And a good example of that is in 1980, there was gene cloning, and it was purposely licensed with non-exclusive patents to 468 countries companies that created 2,400 products. So here's a good example where the profits were secondary to getting something that was valuable to everyone out to the public. And even though it ended up creating companies and products, at least it was initially done for the benefit of the public at large. And one of the things that's interesting about this whole aspect, too, that corporations want universities to get involved in startups and business expenses, is the fact that right from the beginning, private investors are reluctant to invest in a lot of risky ventures, and that includes a lot of risky ventures that colleges are willing to do, particularly because they get research and development money from the taxpayers and from the federal government. And the federal government, of course, is interested in a lot of programs that aren't necessarily immediately viable and profitable. So private investors are not as interested in taking those kind of risks. Well, this way, the college and the government and the taxpayer takes all the risks, and the corporations reap all the benefits. And it's interesting, too, because the universities claim that they're making so much money off of this system like this, and that it benefits everyone. But the fact is that universities don't actually make that much return on the deals themselves. They give such sweetheart deals to these corporations. They actually depend on the largesse of the investors making donations back to the school. So that's where their money comes from. So another layer of cronyism on top of everything else we've talked about, where the universities don't actually make that much money off of these deals. They basically just get kickbacks from the private investors. And a good example of that is a guy named Alan Mendelson, who incidentally is a University of California regent. He's also a lawyer and investor who's been around for the last 30 years, and he's behind this new drive at the University of California to privatize further and create this corporate entity to help the University of California sort out its patents and inventions and getting them to the market. And it turns out from a 2012 disclosure that Alan Mendelson has direct investments in 9 biotech companies that stand to make a huge amount of money and off the sweetheart deals from the University of California. And he also has stock in 18 other related companies. So he's an insider's insider. And the history of this is rather interesting as well. I don't have as much detail as I've had before, because I'm relying only on a couple of articles, but it appears that after World War II, the attitude was that government-funded research needn't depend on for-profit commercialization to bring new inventions to the public. And a good example of this was when Jonas Salk developed a polio vaccine, and he didn't patent it. He could have patented it. And there's also another story about Nikola Tesla, basically turning down a contract with Westinghouse worth billions because he wanted to make sure that this technology got to the people. So, but that was a post-World War II attitude, and then in the 1970s, all that changed because revenue streams started being created by patenting inventions, and then the dam broke in 1980 with the Bayh-Dole Act, and it basically addressed patent and trademark laws, but what it did is it opened it up so that universities used this Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 to interpret it as giving schools ownership of federally funded research on campus, which technically it did. So we ended up with schools setting up technology transfer offices all over the country because now they had a huge advantage because the school claimed ownership of all the federally funded research on campuses. And they claimed institutional ownership of all inventions created by not only faculty, but graduate students. So needless to say, once again, follow the money trail or follow a situation where the potential for huge profits is sniffed out. And all the usual bad actors will descend on the situation. This is a good example of that. And University of Washington, as I mentioned earlier, they created a version of NUCO, this corporate entity that's going to be set up at the University of California. And in 5 years, it put $100 million. University of Washington put $100 million of taxpayer federal money into their Center for Commercialization. And like I said earlier, in 5 years for a school to put $100 million into this program, obviously they're looking for some kind of payoff. But of course, the University of Washington Medical School is one of the most respected in the country and has all sorts of potential profits. And like I mentioned already, they're in cahoots with Microsoft and some of the other local companies, and a lot of patents and companies have already been created out of the public research laboratories of the University of Washington. And one of the disadvantages, of course, is that this stifles public access to a lot of material, because instead of it immediately coming available to the public and maybe solving some problems, they have to negotiate for years in these financial deals and these patent deals and these sweetheart deals and these terms. And the UCLA had an incident before that is a perfect example of this. They have multi-million-dollar private businesses that are created and based on cancer treatments that doctors took private. And they created a company called AgentSys. And in the next 15 years after it was created, they took 156 patents from public research. And of course, the biggest winners are a small group of big investors. And by 2007, that company that was created by UCLA doctors involved in cancer treatments, by 2007, that company was sold to a Japanese company for $537 million. So those are the kind of jackpots that these guys are looking for, a big buyout like that, especially to create a company and then sell it out to somebody much larger. And so anyway, there's an overview of one story that tells us a whole lot about what the state of colleges is, and public research that's been done. It's just a gravy train for corporations. Taxpayer money, and schools do all the legwork, take all the risks, and then the corporations come in and take all the advantages. The same way they do with the sports programs. The colleges take all the risks. The taxpayers and federal government funnel money into these schools and pay these exorbitant salaries in these sports programs and all these benefits for these up-and-coming sports stars, and then it's just a recruiting ground for giant corporate sports mega corporations. That's a topic for another video. But let me wrap up this discussion with saying even more ironic on top of everything I've just talked about is that we live in an age when tuitions are skyrocketing. So while we have all this taxpayer money going into the schools, all this federal money going into these schools, and these incredibly exorbitant tuitions that keep going up and up and up and up, and then the fact that we have the alumni pouring money into these schools, and the fact that they have to still find these angles to supposedly reap more money by cozying up with corporations and cutting them sweetheart deals and all this public research. So anyway, there you have it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too. And remember, if I agreed with you, then we'd both be wrong.